opening the center for rapid piece development, staking a claim on key squares, and immediately challenging black's potential central expansion. A fight for central squares begins immediately, creating an unbalanced, dynamic position from the outset. Commanding the center and preparing for queenside play, a classic approach. Establishing central influence and preparing for the Sicilians' dynamic play. Opening the center immediately challenges black's setup and creates dynamic possibilities. Opening the center allows for dynamic piece play and a race for initiative across the entire board. A direct challenge to black's central structure, opening lines and eyeing key squares with invigorated knight power. Developing the knight challenges the central knight immediately, fostering dynamic piece play. Securing the central knight establishes a robust pawn structure and prepares for pawn advances. Securing the b5 outpost with a tempo gambit, preparing for queenside expansion. Shifting the knight from its centralized outpost to b3 now aims to secure the queenside, perhaps preparing for b4 to gain space, while also subtly freeing up c3 for another piece, anticipating a future pawn push or development. Nailing down the pawn structure, black prepares to develop the bishop, aiming for a harmonious setup. This subtle pawn advance subtly curtails white's knight's ambition on b3, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop, anticipating future activity. Unleashing a bold pawn storm on the kingside, white immediately seeks to rupture black's defensive structure, aiming for swift kingside play and potentially opening lines towards the enemy monarch. Launching a pawn storm on the queenside, black aims to create immediate counterplay against white's aggressive kingside advances. This creates an interesting positional imbalance, forcing white to consider defending their own king while simultaneously dealing with black's growing space on the flank. Unleashing the bishop to its most expansive diagonal, white prepares to support the central pawn push and survey the queenside landscape, potentially initiating a pawn storm or a rapid development sequence. Black establishes an active bishop, eyeing the d4 knight and preparing for potential central pawn breaks like d5, while also reinforcing the queenside. Pushing the pawn to g5 gambits kingside space, aiming to disrupt black's bishop development and potentially create weaknesses around the dark squares. It forces a decision for the knight, potentially creating a target or leading to a more dynamic game where white seeks to exploit the open lines. Injecting immediate diagonal pressure, black ruptures white's pawn structure on the queenside, sacrificing material to unleash the dark-squared bishop and create immediate attacking prospects against the white king's position. Unleashing a knight onto d5 creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially isolate that b4 pawn while gaining central influence. A sharp, double-edged exchange that tears open lines, but does it create enough pressure to justify the open king? You've surrendered central control and handed your opponent a powerful knight on d5. Now, every subsequent move must be a tightrope walk to avoid quick defeat. Exploiting black's pawn structure weakness, white's pawn sacrifice forcefully opens the g-file, aiming to pry open the kingside and generate immediate attacking chances against the exposed black monarch. Opening a critical diagonal for the dark-squared bishop and preparing to develop the queen, this recapture aims to simplify the central structure and gain activity, though it creates a somewhat isolated pawn on e4. This maneuver aims to activate the bishop, bringing it into the game with tempo by attacking the knight on d5, simultaneously preparing to castle and challenge black's overextended pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn, but at what cost to your king's safety? This recapture, while understandable, opens up the g-file directly towards your monarch, creating immediate defensive concerns that will demand your full attention. Consider how the bishop on b7 might find itself a little cramped, and how the piece on d5 will need to be dealt with. Unleashing the queen to probe the kingside, white seeks to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potential entry squares, creating immediate pressure that black must address carefully to avoid a swift collapse. Reclaiming the pawn structure from the prior skirmish, the rook embarks on a bold, albeit potentially exposed, journey to the g-file, aiming to disrupt white's immediate attacking ambitions and potentially open lines for counterplay. Clearing the path for the queen's aggressive sweep across the back ranks, the bishop repositions to a more influential diagonal, aiming to amplify pressure on black's weakened kingside structure and exploit the now open g-file. The knight's leap to c6 boldly challenges white's center and opens pathways for black's own pieces, aiming to disrupt white's attacking ambitions by activating the queen's bishop and potentially preparing a queenside counterthrust. The king now bravely ventures to the queenside, creating a fascinating counterplay scenario where both monarchs are exposed. White's commitment to this flank, however, opens up intriguing tactical possibilities on the now semi-open g-file, potentially forcing black into difficult defensive calculations. Seizing the initiative with a pawn thrust into the heart of white's camp, this knight maneuver dramatically alters the tactical landscape, aiming to pry open the kingside and exploit the exposed royal. Sacrificing the queen here to open up a devastating discovered attack on the castled king, unleashing the powerful bishop on g2, which was previously obstructed. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank immediately combats the rampant queen and offers a vital defensive redeployment, subtly questioning the safety of white's overextended queen and seeking to neutralize the newly opened g-file's pressure. The queen retreats, sacrificing the pawn on h7 to avoid an immediate exchange and maintain attacking pressure on the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to exploit the open g-file. Focusing on the king's safety after that aggressive pawn push on the kingside, black now tries to regroup by developing the bishop to a more central square, aiming to support a potential queenside expansion or even prepare for a later exchange sacrifice. The intention is to challenge white's seemingly dominant attacking posture by creating active counterplay rather than passively defending. Sharpens the attack on the kingside by directly challenging black's bishop, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure around the king and potentially create mating threats. Repositioning the rook behind the attacking queen, this move seeks to shield the black king and simultaneously prepare for a potential rook lift to the kingside or a repositioning to the h-file, aiming to complicate the game and challenge white's aggressive pawn structure. Unleashing a brutal pawn sacrifice, white immediately cracks open the queenside defenses, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy king with devastating queen and bishop activity. With the capture on f5, black decisively seizes a crucial central outpost, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and opening up avenues for further piece development. This knight's aggressive repositioning not only threatens white's kingside, but also creates a powerful central presence that can be exploited to gain initiative. The exchange has now significantly reduced white's attacking potential and initiated a dynamic shift towards black's favor. Opening up new lines of attack, white's bishop now targets the critical diagonal towards black's king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure that black has created. The bishop finds a vital post on g6, subtly pressuring the d4 knight and preparing to support a potential queenside expansion with the c-pawn. The queen's repositioning to e2 signals a pragmatic assessment of the tangled pawn structure, prioritizing development over immediate aggression, and aiming to consolidate white's rather exposed king while exploring potential pawn breaks on the queenside or a regrouping of forces to defend the vulnerable f2 square. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm now creates immediate pressure against white's king, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially opening lines for black's rooks, though it does concede significant central space and weakens the queenside pawn structure. Injecting a fresh attacker to the queenside, the knight pivots, eyeing potential disruptions and aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals that are forming, subtly shifting the initiative toward the flank. Opening a crucial diagonal for the queen and indirectly reinforcing the d5 pawn, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's central control and prepare for a more active kingside presence, potentially by advancing the h-pawn or repositioning pieces to either weakened kingside. The king's escape route is now a gaping vulnerability as white forcefully repositions the queen to exploit black's fractured pawn structure. A bold reclaiming of tempo, this queen maneuver seeks to untangle the complex web of pieces that have entangled the board, aiming to connect the rooks and offer a much-needed diagonal outlet for the bishop. A daring gambit to seize initiative. Pushing forward with the h-pawn aims to crack open the kingside further and create escape routes for your queen, though it leaves the king's immediate vicinity somewhat exposed. This pawn thrust aggressively fights for queenside space, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn shield and potentially open lines against the enemy king's defenses. The pawn push aggressively carves out space on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially launch further assaults. Repositioning the bishop to the active square h7 offers the bishop a more expansive view of the board and prepares to defend against any potential threats on the kingside, while also maintaining the option to later redeploy to g6 or even f5 should the opportunity arise. This exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, simplifying the position and initiating a transition into an endgame where king activity will be paramount, and the isolated pawn on d5 presents a strategic target. Relinquishing the queen trade opens a complex strategic battleground where black's king, though somewhat exposed, now aims to leverage the newly formed pawn chains for active counterplay, forcing white to carefully consider the long-term implications of their king's safety versus territorial gains. Unlocking the c-file for potential invasion, the knight embarks on a journey to outpost itself, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially fork pieces. Securing the king from the rampant knight and preparing for an active rook lift presents an immediate tactical hurdle for white, demanding careful defensive repositioning rather than further aggressive advances. Exploiting the open file, the rook penetrates deep into black's territory, initiating a decisive onslaught against the vulnerable king. Instigating a dynamic defense, black aims to liberate the rook from its constricted position, seeking active counterplay on the queenside by targeting the now exposed d5 pawn and creating a potential passed pawn scenario. Reclaiming the open d-file with the rook is a pivotal step, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the vulnerability of the d5 pawn. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's entrenched position, sacrificing material for a flicker of counterplay. The knight's sortie to d3, while momentarily annoying, feels like a final Hail Mary in a game where white's superior piece activity and control of the d-file are overwhelming. Observe how the white queen's safe haven on d2, post-exchange, alongside the menacing knight on b5, paints a grim picture for black's exposed monarch and constricted pieces. This aggressive knight maneuver essentially signals black's resignation to a positional disadvantage, seeking to complicate matters before the inevitable collapse. The kingside pawn storm has completely dissipated, and white's capture on d3 now opens up the c-file, creating immediate pressure on black's weakened pawn structure. This sacrifice of material might seem drastic, but it's a desperate attempt to gain positional compensation by disrupting black's coordination and potentially creating an open diagonal for the light-squared bishop if it can find an active post. Your king, now exposed to the open files, faces immense pressure from white's active pieces, particularly the rook on the d-file. The resulting pawn structure leaves you with weaknesses that will be difficult to defend as the endgame unfolds. Slaying the passed pawn opens a crucial diagonal for white's remaining pieces and signals the immediate transition into a simplified, but still sharp, endgame where king's safety will be paramount. A risky king excursion, venturing far from its protective pawns, now faces immediate tactical scrutiny. Unleashing a furious check, the rook now aims to pry open the a-file, seeking to penetrate black's beleaguered king position and exploit the exposed nature of the monarch. Unleashing the black king from its defensive shell now offers a surprising counterplay, transforming a seemingly lost endgame into a dynamic battleground where white's material advantage is less decisive than the sudden exposure of his own monarch. Initiating a relentless attack on the exposed monarch, this check carves a pathway to exploit black's vulnerable king. White forces a change of scenery, aiming to dislodge the enemy king from its precarious perch and transition into a winning endgame where material advantage might be converted. The king's flight is now severely restricted, and any defensive maneuver will likely involve further concessions. The black king, seeking refuge, finds itself in a precarious position, as the white rook on f4 aggressively eyes the open third rank, aiming to pry open further lines towards the monarch. Unleashing a decisive check, the knight targets the exposed black king, forcing its retreat and setting up a potential royal hunt across the board. A bold king march, seeking to exploit the open files and perhaps create a passed pawn, but the journey through this tangled position is fraught with peril. This pawn advance, venturing to c6, aims to corral black's outposts and initiate a swift advance against the weakened kingside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for a decisive attack. A desperate attempt to tie down white's knight and perhaps disrupt the impending breakthrough on the d-file. Relocating the monarch to d1 is a prudent measure, securing the king from further tactical harassment on the open d-file and preparing to potentially activate the rook from the d-file into the fight. The bishop retreats to its starting square, a seemingly passive maneuver, yet it prepares to activate onto the a-file, aiming to disrupt white's precarious pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. Asserting pressure along the 7th rank, the knight maneuvers to a critical outpost, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and create new attacking avenues. A bold attempt to block the advancing knight and potentially solidify the rook's position on the d-file, though it does open up the c-file for white's rook to potentially exploit. Sacrificing the rook on f6, white initiates a desperate attempt to exploit black's slightly exposed king by creating a powerful passed pawn on the h-file. This aggressive maneuver aims to distract black and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces, hoping to force an immediate decision or create mating threats before black can consolidate their material advantage. Unleashing the bishop to g7 aims to reroute it to a more active square, perhaps the f6 square or even back to the kingside, seeking to participate in the defense of the now exposed black king. This maneuver also implicitly aims to open the g-file for potential counterplay, or at least deny white the easy use of that file. The move recognizes the passive position of the piece after being driven back and seeks to inject some life into the defense, all while keeping an eye on the precarious pawn structure. Pivoting the rook to attack the pinned bishop on g7 seizes a crucial central file, preparing to unravel white's weakened pawn structure and potentially isolate black's king. Sacrificing material for initiative often leads to tricky tactical sequences, and here, black's decision to take the bishop opens a Pandora's box of possibilities. While it's true white's king is relatively safe, and the passed pawn on a4 is a nuisance, giving up the bishop in exchange for that pawn, especially when the king is so exposed, feels like a gamble. The material imbalance is now stark. White is significantly ahead. The critical question is whether black can generate enough threats to compensate for the lost pieces and coordinate an attack before white's extra pawns and better-placed pieces run rampant. This move introduces a sharp, double-edged situation where the slightest misstep by either side could be fatal. Clearing the path for the rook's assault along the now-open h-file creates immediate threats to the black king's safety, forcing a desperate defensive reorganization. A desperate attempt to create counterplay, this pawn push unearths the b2 bishop's latent power and opens a vital pathway for the rook. But it also leaves the white king a clear path to safety, while the black king remains exposed, and the pawn structure is severely compromised. Opening the queenside with this pawn capture dramatically alters the landscape, creating an immediate imbalance in material and pawn structure. White achieves a passed pawn on the b-file, a potent threat that demands black's constant attention. The king is now exposed on the queenside, and while black has some connected passed pawns of their own, white's activity on the now-open file presents a significant challenge. This maneuver forces a fundamental shift in black's defensive strategy. Securing the b2 pawn with the bishop allows the pawn to march forward aggressively, aiming to infiltrate white's defenses and create a passed pawn on the queenside. Unleashing a final tempo on the bishop targets a potential queenside breakthrough while simultaneously reinforcing the knight's outpost. The black king, a once powerful piece, is now awkwardly exposed on c3 after this unexpected royal sally. The king, exposed on the checkered battlefield, scrambles to find sanctuary, a desperate dance for survival. King activation, though often a defensive tool, now spectacularly transforms into a potent attacking force. its presence directly threatening white's crucial pieces and forcing a drastic reevaluation of the remaining forces on the board. King's safety has completely dissolved, forcing a desperate retreat to a square that offers minimal protection. The bishop's repositioning aims to disrupt the coordination of white's rook and knight, potentially creating an escape square for the king or setting up an intermediate tactic.